The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street of Redemption Creek, a frontier town clinging to existence in the harsh Wyoming territory of 1878. The settlement had sprung up around a dried riverbed that occasionally flooded during spring thaws, bringing just enough water to sustain the stubborn souls who'd staked their claims here. Wooden buildings lined both sides of the unpaved main street, their facades weathered gray by wind and sun, paint peeling like dead skin from boards that had seen better days. The Saloon, grandly named the Golden Promise, stood at the corner of Main and Creek Streets, its swinging doors offering the only entertainment for miles in any direction. Inside, the familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco smoke, and unwashed men created an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife. The piano in the corner sat silent this early in the day, waiting for the evening crowd when miners and ranch hands would flood in, with dust in their throats and coins in their pockets. Please subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Through those swinging doors walked a man who'd seen more than his share of hard miles. Samuel Garrett was 53 years old, though the lines carved deep into his weathered face suggested he'd lived twice that many years. His clothes were road-worn and patched, the kind of garments that marked a man as a drifter, someone who owned nothing but what he carried on his back and in his saddlebags. The brown canvas duster he wore was faded nearly white in places, stained with the dust of a dozen territories and the sweat of countless hot days under an unforgiving sun. His boots, once fine leather, were cracked and worn thin at the soles, held together by wire and determination. The wide-brimmed hat on his head had lost its shape years ago, slouching at angles that no amount of steaming and reshaping could correct. Yet despite his ragged appearance, there was something in Samuel's bearing that spoke of better days, a certain straightness to his spine that suggested military service, or perhaps the confidence of a man who'd once commanded respect. Samuel approached the bar with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to measure distances and assess threats before committing to movement. The bartender, a thick-necked man named Horace, with arms like fence posts and a belly that tested the buttons on his stained vest, looked him over with the practiced eye of someone who'd served every type of customer the West could produce. Samuel placed 3 worn coins on the scarred wooden surface, each one carefully counted from a leather pouch that clearly contained few others. The clink of copper against wood was barely audible over the low murmur of conversation from the handful of afternoon patrons scattered at tables throughout the dim interior. Horace poured a measure of whiskey into a glass that had seen better days, the amber liquid catching what little light filtered through the grimy windows. Samuel wrapped his calloused fingers around the glass and raised it slowly, savoring the moment before the burn would hit his throat, a small pleasure in a life that offered precious few. The saloon's atmosphere changed when Sheriff Wade Morrison pushed through the swinging doors with the swagger of a man who wore his authority like armor. At 35, Wade was young for a lawman in these parts, but he'd earned his badge through a combination of quick reflexes with a gun and a willingness to enforce the law with whatever force necessary. His black leather vest was polished to a shine, a stark contrast to his dust-covered surroundings, and the silver star pinned to his chest caught the light like a mirror. Twin Colt revolvers rode low on his hips in oiled holsters, positioned for a quick draw that he'd practiced until the movement was as natural as breathing. Wade's clean-shaven face and neatly trimmed hair marked him as someone who took pride in his appearance, someone who understood that in a lawless territory, looking the part could be as important as being the part. His boots, recently polished, clicked against the wooden floor as he made his way to the bar, his eyes scanning the room with the habitual wariness of a man whose job made enemies faster than friends. Wade's gaze fell on Samuel, and something shifted in his expression, a subtle tightening around the eyes that suggested instant judgment. In the rigid social hierarchy of frontier towns, appearances mattered, and Samuel's ragged clothes marked him as someone of no consequence, perhaps even a threat to the orderly community Wade had sworn to protect. The sheriff sidled up to the bar a few feet from where Samuel stood, close enough to make his presence known, but maintaining a distance that allowed him to react if the stranger proved troublesome. Wade signaled Horace for a drink, then turned his attention fully to Samuel, his lips curling into a smirk that held no warmth whatsoever. The other patrons in the saloon sensed the tension, conversations dying away as men turned to watch what would unfold, always hungry for entertainment, in a place where boredom could be more deadly than bullets. Samuel, for his part, kept his eyes on his whiskey glass, the set of his shoulders suggesting a man who'd weathered worse storms than a young sheriff's contempt. "Horace," Wade said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "when did we start letting saddle tramps drink in the same establishment as decent folk?" His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having his words listened to and obeyed. Samuel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but he didn't look up, didn't rise to the bait being dangled before him like a worm on a hook. Wade continued, emboldened by Samuel's silence and the growing audience of onlookers. "I mean, look at him. Probably hasn't had an honest job in years, if ever. Just drifting from town to town, looking for charity, or maybe an easy mark to rob." The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke, harsh and acrid. Several men at nearby tables chuckled, the nervous laughter of people grateful that someone else had become the target of the sheriff's attention. Horace wiped at the bar with a rag that was dirtier than the wood it was meant to clean, his face carefully neutral, unwilling to side against the law, but also unwilling to actively participate in humiliating a paying customer. Samuel finally raised his eyes to meet Wade's gaze, and for just a moment, the sheriff saw something there that made. But Samuel's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and measured, each word chosen with the care of a man who understood that in the West, words could start fights as easily as drawn guns. "I paid for my drink, Sheriff. Same as any man here. I'm not looking for trouble. Just a moment's rest before I move on." The reasonableness of his tone only seemed to irritate Wade further, as if Samuel's refusal to be provoked was itself a form of insubordination. The sheriff downed his whiskey in one quick motion, then stepped closer to Samuel, invading his space with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never learned the danger of pushing too hard. "Move on sounds like an excellent idea," Wade said, his hand resting casually on the grip of one of his revolvers, a gesture calculated to intimidate. "In fact, why don't you finish that drink and keep right on moving? We don't need your kind in Redemption Creek. We're building something here, a civilized town, and we can't have every broken-down drifter thinking he can just wander in and make himself at home." Samuel's knuckles whitened around his glass, but his voice remained steady, almost gentle, as if he were speaking to a child who didn't understand the consequences of his actions. "I'll move on when I'm ready, Sheriff. Like I said, I paid for my drink. I'm not breaking any laws. The tension in the room had become almost physical, a pressure that made men shift uncomfortably in their chairs and caused Horace to move slowly away from the potential line of fire. Wade's face flushed with anger at being contradicted, especially in front of the townspeople he'd worked so hard to impress with his authority and control. "You want to test me, old man?" Wade's voice had dropped to a dangerous growl, his fingers flexing near his gun. "You want to see if I'm as quick as they say? Because I'll tell you right now, I've put down better men than you for less than mouthing off to a lawman." Samuel set his glass down carefully on the bar, the last of his whiskey untouched, and turned slowly to face Wade, fully. The movement revealed the worn grip of an old Navy Colt tucked into his belt, half hidden by his duster, a weapon that had clearly seen decades of use. But Samuel made no move toward it, his hands remaining visible and away from any weapons. Instead, he looked at Wade with an expression that might have been pity, which only infuriated the young sheriff more. "Sheriff," Samuel said quietly, "I don't want trouble. I've had enough fighting to last several lifetimes. I'm just passing through, looking for work, maybe a place to rest my bones for a few days. Is that really so threatening to you and your civilized town?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Wade seemed to consider it, his anger warring with something else, perhaps a flicker of doubt or shame. But pride is a powerful force, especially in young men who've built their reputations on being tough and uncompromising. Wade's hand moved to his gun, not drawing it, but wrapping his fingers around the grip in a clear threat. "Last chance, Drifter. Walk out that door now, get on whatever broken-down nag you rode in on, and keep riding until Redemption Creek is nothing but a dust cloud behind you. Or we can settle this right here, right now." Samuel closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was a profound sadness there, the sorrow of a man watching someone make a terrible mistake. He reached slowly into his inside vest pocket, moving with exaggerated care to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. Wade's gun was halfway out of its holster when Samuel produced a worn leather wallet, cracked with age and stained with sweat and weather. From this, he extracted a faded photograph, yellowed at the edges and creased from years of being carried close to someone's heart. Samuel held out the photograph toward Wade, his hand steady despite the gun now fully drawn and pointed at his chest. "Before you do something you'll regret, Sheriff, take a look at this." Wade, confused by this unexpected response, kept his gun trained on Samuel, but leaned forward slightly to see what the Drifter was offering. The photograph showed two men in Union Army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning with the careless confidence of soldiers who'd survived battles that should have killed them. One of the men was younger, but unmistakably Samuel Garrett, his face unlined and full of the vigor of youth, his uniform crisp and his bearing proud. The other man was older, with a thick mustache and captain's insignia on his collar. His eyes crinkled with laughter as he looked at the camera. Wade stared at the photograph, his gun slowly lowering as recognition began to dawn on his face. The older man in the photograph looked remarkably familiar, bearing a striking resemblance to someone Wade had known well, someone who'd shaped his entire life. "That's your father," Samuel said quietly, his voice thick with memory and emotion. "Captain Thomas Morrison, Company C, 3rd Cavalry Regiment. We served together during the war, and for several years after, chasing down Confederate raiders who didn't want to accept that the fighting was over. Wade's gun hand dropped to his side, the weapon suddenly forgotten, as he stared at the photograph with an expression of shock and dawning horror. Samuel continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken and memories long held in check were flooding out. Your father was the finest officer I ever served under. Fair but firm. Brave without being reckless. He had this way of making every man in the company feel like his opinion mattered, like we weren't just tools to be used up and thrown away. Wade's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the photograph, and Samuel handed it over without hesitation, trusting the young sheriff in a way that moments ago would have seemed impossible. Wade studied the image of his father, seeing him as he'd never known him, young and vital and full of life. Thomas Morrison had died when Wade was only 15, killed in a stupid accident involving a spooked horse and a rocky ravine, leaving his son with memories of a stern but loving father who'd tried to instill values of honor and duty. But Wade had never known his father as a soldier, had never heard the stories of his wartime service, because Thomas had refused to speak of those days, considering them a dark chapter best left closed. Now, holding this photograph and looking at his father's younger face, Wade felt a profound connection to a past he'd never fully understood. Samuel watched the play of emotions across the sheriff's face and continued his story, his voice steady now, falling into the rhythm of a tale he'd told himself countless times over the years, but had rarely shared with others. It was April of 1872, down in New Mexico territory. A group of Comancheros had been raiding settlements, stealing horses and supplies, killing anyone who resisted. Your father and I were part of a small detachment, sent to track them down and put a stop to it. The saloon had gone completely silent now, every man hanging on Samuel's words. The earlier tension transformed into rapt attention. Samuel gestured to an empty table, and Wade, moving as if in a dream, holstered his gun and sat down heavily, his eyes never leaving the photograph in his hands. Samuel joined him, and Horace, sensing the importance of the moment, brought over a bottle and 2 clean glasses without being asked, setting them on the table with uncharacteristic gentleness. Samuel poured for both of them, the amber liquid catching the dusty light filtering through the windows. And Wade drank automatically, barely tasting the whiskey that moments ago had been such a casual pleasure. We tracked the Comancheros to a box canyon about 50 miles south of Fort Stanton, Samuel continued, his gaze distant as he looked back through the years to that fateful day. It should have been a simple operation. Surround them and either arrest them or put them down if they resisted. But someone had tipped them off, and they were waiting for us, hidden in the rocks above the canyon entrance. Samuel's voice took on a harder edge, the memories clearly painful even after all these years. They opened fire the moment we rode into the canyon, killed 3 men in the first volley, including Lieutenant Hayes, who'd been riding point. Your father took command immediately, got the rest of us into cover behind some boulders at the canyon mouth, and we returned fire. But we were pinned down, and the Comancheros had the high ground and all the ammunition in the world. Wade listened intently, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away, replaced by a desperate need to understand what had happened to his father all those years ago, to know the man behind the stern face that had watched over his childhood. Samuel drank deeply from his glass, fortifying himself for the next part of the story. We were there for hours, the sun beating down on us, men dying from wounds we couldn't treat because there was no cover to move them. Your father was magnificent, keeping everyone calm, rationing our ammunition, waiting for nightfall when we might be able to retreat or flank them under cover of darkness. The story was interrupted briefly by the arrival of 3 men who'd heard there was some kind of confrontation happening at the saloon and wanted to see if the sheriff needed backup. Wade waved them away impatiently, his full attention on Samuel and the tale he was telling, a story that was rewriting everything he thought he knew about his father's life. The men withdrew, confused but obedient, leaving the sheriff and the drifter to their conversation, while the other patrons strained to hear every word. Samuel continued, his voice dropping lower, as if the words were being pulled from some deep well of memory and pain. Late in the afternoon, your father decided he needed to get a better view of their positions, see if there was a way to outflank them when darkness came. He moved to a different boulder about 30 yards away, zigzagging to avoid the worst of their fire. He made it there safely, started surveying their positions with his field glasses. Samuel paused, his eyes closing briefly, as if seeing the scene play out behind his eyelids. That's when I saw him, a Comanchero with a rifle, positioned in a crevice that gave him a perfect line of sight to where your father was crouched. The captain couldn't see him from his angle, didn't know the danger he was in. Wade's knuckles were white where he gripped his whiskey glass, his entire body tense as he waited for what came next. Samuel opened his eyes and looked directly at Wade, his pale blue gaze holding the sheriff's as he delivered the heart of his story. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I stood up from cover, drew a bead on that Comanchero, and fired. The bullet took him right in the chest, killed him before he could pull his trigger on your father. But standing up to take that shot exposed me to fire from 6 other positions. Samuel pulled aside his collar, revealing an old scar that ran from his shoulder down toward his chest, a puckered line of flesh that spoke of a bullet that had come within inches of ending his life. I took 2 rounds before I could get back to cover, one in the shoulder and one that creased my ribs. Lost a lot of blood, would have died right there if your father hadn't risked his own life to reach me and drag me back to safety. Wade stared at the scar, then back at the photograph, then at Samuel's weathered face, seeing the man in an entirely different light now. Your father saved my life that day, Samuel said quietly. Carried me on his back when we finally made our retreat after nightfall. Wouldn't leave me behind, even though I was slowing everyone down and putting them all at risk. Got me to an army surgeon who patched me up well enough that I survived, though I lost the use of my left arm for almost a year. Samuel flexed his fingers, demonstrating the lingering stiffness that still affected his movements. Decades later, your father visited me every day while I recovered, brought me books to read, made sure I had everything I needed. He never mentioned that I'd saved his life, never made a big deal out of it. That was his way, humble to the core, always thinking about his men before himself. Wade felt tears stinging his eyes, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, certainly never in public, where his position as sheriff demanded a hard exterior. But the image of his father as a young captain, caring for his wounded men with such dedication, moved something deep inside him that years of frontier toughness couldn't protect. After we both recovered and were discharged from the army, we went our separate ways. Samuel continued, his voice tinged with regret. Your father headed back to Wyoming territory, said he wanted to settle down, maybe start a family. I drifted west, tried my hand at prospecting, working cattle, whatever jobs came my way. We kept in touch for a few years through letters, but eventually, those stopped coming. I heard about his death probably 2 years after it happened. Was working a ranch down in Colorado at the time. Hit me hard, harder than I expected. I wanted to come to the funeral, to pay my respects, but by then, I was broke and too proud to show up looking like a beggar at his grave. Wade's hand unconsciously went to the photograph, touching his father's face with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who'd witnessed his earlier aggression. Samuel watched this gesture and felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying all these years. "I've thought about your father often over the years," Samuel said, his voice almost a whisper now. "Wondered what kind of life he built, whether he found the peace he was looking for. I never knew he had a son, never knew that the line of Thomas Morrison continued." Wade finally found his voice, though it was rough with emotion and barely above a whisper. "He never told me any of this. Never mentioned the war, never talked about his service. I always wondered why. Thought maybe he was ashamed of something that happened over there." Samuel shook his head emphatically, understanding dawning on his face. He wasn't ashamed. Men like your father, the good ones, they carried the weight of the men they lost, the orders they gave that resulted in deaths. He probably wanted to protect you from all that darkness, wanted you to know him as a father, not as a soldier who'd seen and done terrible things in the name of duty. Wade absorbed this. His understanding of his father suddenly expanded and deepened in ways he never could have imagined when he'd walked into the saloon an hour ago. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable, both men lost in their own thoughts and memories. Finally, Wade looked up at Samuel with an expression that mixed shame, gratitude, and something approaching awe. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words seemed inadequate for what he was trying to express. "I'm sorry for how I treated you, for judging you based on your clothes and circumstances. I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong." Samuel waved away the apology with a gesture that suggested he'd been on the receiving end of worse treatment many times before. "You didn't know. In your position, you see a lot of men like me, drifters and troublemakers, and you have to make quick judgments to keep your town safe. I understand that. But maybe this can be a lesson, that you never know what a man has been through, what he's done, or who he's saved, just by looking at his worn-out boots and patched coat." Wade nodded, the wisdom of this sinking in deeper than any lecture from his father ever had. "What brings you to Redemption Creek?" Wade asked, his tone now respectful, genuinely interested, rather than confrontational. Samuel shifted in his chair, suddenly looking older and more tired than he had even a few moments before. "I'm looking for work, Sheriff. Any kind of honest labor. My savings are running low, and winter's coming on. I'd like to find a place to stay for a few months, maybe save up enough to keep moving in the spring." Wade's mind was already working, thinking of possibilities, wanting to make amends in some tangible way for his earlier behavior. "Can you still shoot?" he asked. "I mean, with your shoulder injury, can you handle a gun?" Samuel's lips curved in a slight smile, the first real expression of humor Wade had seen on the weathered face. "I can still shoot well enough to hit what I'm aiming at, if that's what you're asking. The left shoulder's weak, but I learned to compensate, rely more on my right side." Wade leaned forward, an idea taking shape. "I could use a deputy. The last one quit 2 months ago, said the pay wasn't worth the risk. It's not much money, but it comes with a room in the back of the jail and meals at the boarding house. Samuel's eyes widened slightly, surprise evident on his face. Sheriff, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not sure that's such a good idea. I'm 53 years old, not exactly in my prime for law enforcement work. Wade shook his head firmly, his decision made. You saved my father's life. That counts for more than any amount of quick reflexes or sharp shooting. Besides, you've got experience and judgment that I lack. I'm young, maybe too young for this job, and I've been making mistakes, as today proved pretty clearly. Samuel studied the sheriff's face, seeing genuine sincerity there, not pity or obligation, but actual respect. Are you sure about this? Your townspeople might not take kindly to you hiring a ragged drifter as your deputy. Wade stood up, his voice carrying clearly through the saloon. Any man who has a problem with my new deputy can take it up with me directly. Samuel Garrett served honorably in the United States Army, saved the life of my father, and that's good enough recommendation for anyone in this town or any other. The other patrons in the saloon, who'd been listening to the entire exchange with rapt attention, broke into spontaneous applause. Horace came over with the bottle and refilled both glasses, this time on the house, a gesture of apology for his earlier neutrality in the face of the sheriff's bullying. Samuel sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the sudden turn his fortunes had taken. I don't know what to say, Sheriff. I came in here just looking for a drink and maybe directions to the nearest town where I might find work. I certainly didn't expect this. Wade extended his hand across the table, and Samuel took it, the handshake firm and meaningful, sealing an agreement that went far beyond employment. Call me Wade, and I'm the one who should be thanking you. You saved my father's life, which means you're responsible for my existence. That's a debt that can never truly be repaid, but I'd like to try. Samuel felt something inside him shift, a wall he'd built around his heart after years of hardship beginning to crumble. All right then, Wade, I accept your offer. Though I warn you, I'm set in my ways and might not take well to being bossed around by someone half my age. Wade laughed, a genuine sound of relief and happiness that transformed his face from hard-edged lawman to youthful man, still learning his place in the world. I have a feeling you'll teach me more than I'll ever teach you. The two men finished their drinks and stood, preparing to leave the saloon and begin this unexpected partnership. As they headed toward the door, several of the patrons stopped them to introduce themselves, wanting to welcome the new deputy and hear more stories about Captain Thomas Morrison. Samuel, who'd grown accustomed to being invisible, or actively avoided in most towns he passed through, found himself surrounded by friendly faces and genuine interest, a warmth he hadn't experienced in longer than he cared to remember. Wade stood back slightly, watching the transformation in both the drifter and the townspeople, realizing that his earlier behavior had set a tone of exclusion and judgment that was now being replaced by curiosity and welcome. Outside the saloon, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and amber. Wade led Samuel down Main Street toward the sheriff's office, pointing out various establishments and introducing him to people they passed along the way. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, promised to have a hot meal ready for Samuel within the hour. Old Tom at the general store offered to extend credit for any supplies the new deputy might need to get properly outfitted. The blacksmith, a massive man named Gus, said he'd check over Samuel's horse and make sure the animal was properly shod and fed. The generosity of these strangers, prompted by Wade's obvious respect for Samuel, moved the older man deeply, reminding him of a time Before the war, when community and mutual support were values he'd taken for granted, Wade, watching these interactions, felt a deep sense of shame for how close he'd come to running off a man who'd saved his father's life, how his arrogance and snap judgments had nearly cost him this connection to his past. The sheriff's office was a solid wood structure at the end of Main Street, built to withstand the occasional attempts by drunk cowboys or angry outlaws to shoot their way out of jail. Wade pushed open the heavy door and led Samuel inside, showing him the simple but functional space that would be his home for the foreseeable future. A small room in the back contained a cot, a washstand, and a trunk for personal belongings. More privacy and comfort than Samuel had enjoyed in years. Wade opened the trunk and pulled out a spare deputy's badge, its silver surface tarnished but still reflecting the light from the window. He handed it to Samuel with a solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of what he was offering. "I know it's not much, but this badge represents the law in Redemption Creek, and I'd be honored if you'd wear it." Samuel took the badge, his fingers tracing the star pattern etched into the metal, feeling the cool smoothness of the silver against his calloused palm. "I'll do my best not to disappoint you, Wade." Wade smiled and clasped Samuel's shoulder, mindful of the old wound. "You already saved the most important person in my life. There's no way you could disappoint me." Over the following days, Samuel settled into his new role as deputy with a quiet competence that quickly earned the respect of the townspeople. He had a calm presence that contrasted with Wade's youthful intensity, and the two men complemented each other well, the sheriff's quick reflexes balanced by the deputy's measured judgment. Samuel proved particularly skilled at diffusing tense situations before they escalated to violence. A talent born from years of experience reading men and understanding what drove them to desperate acts. When drunk miners wanted to shoot up the saloon, Samuel would sit with them and listen to their troubles, often finding the root cause of their anger was loneliness or grief rather than real malice. When ranchers brought disputes over property lines and water rights, Samuel had a knack for finding compromises that left both parties feeling like they'd won something rather than lost. Wade watched and learned, understanding that his earlier approach of leading with authority and the threat of force was less effective than Samuel's method of treating people with dignity and seeking understanding before judgment. The partnership between the young sheriff and the old deputy became something of a legend in Redemption Creek. People told stories about how Wade had mocked a drifter who turned out to be a war hero, how his arrogance had nearly cost him the best deputy he could have hoped for, and how the revelation of Samuel's connection to Wade's father had transformed both men. The tale grew in the telling, as such stories do, but at its core remained a simple truth about the danger of judging people by their appearance and circumstances, rather than their character and deeds. Wade, for his part, took the ribbing good-naturedly, accepting it as deserved punishment for his earlier behavior, and using it as a constant reminder to approach every person with an open mind. He found himself thinking often about what might have happened if Samuel hadn't had that photograph, hadn't been able to prove his connection to Wade's father. How many other worthy people had he dismissed or driven away with his judgment and arrogance? The thought haunted him and drove him to become not just a better lawman, but a better man. Samuel, meanwhile, found in Redemption Creek something he'd been searching for without realizing it: a home. The simple room behind the sheriff's office became his haven, a place where he could lay his head at night without wondering where the next day's journey would take him. The work was challenging but meaningful, and he discovered that he had a talent for law enforcement that he'd never known existed during his Army days. More importantly, he found purpose in mentoring Wade, seeing in the young sheriff echoes of Thomas Morrison's best qualities, along with the impulsiveness and pride that needed tempering with experience and wisdom. In teaching Wade, Samuel found himself reconnecting with values he'd thought he'd lost during his years of drifting: honor, duty, service to others. The badge on his chest became more than just a piece of metal. It became a symbol of his commitment to be worthy of the trust Wade had placed in him, to honor the memory of Thomas Morrison by helping his son become the kind of lawman and man his father would have been proud of. Winter came to Redemption Creek with a vengeance, bringing snowstorms that buried the town under 3 feet of white and temperatures that dropped so low that water froze in buckets inside buildings. But Samuel had a warm place to sleep, regular meals, and work that mattered. Comforts he'd gone without for so long that he'd forgotten what they felt like. He spent the long winter nights in the sheriff's office, keeping the stove burning and listening to Wade talk about his father, filling in gaps in the sheriff's understanding with stories from their service together. Through these conversations, Wade came to know his father as a whole person, not just the stern but loving parent he remembered, but also the brave soldier, the compassionate leader, the flawed human being who'd made mistakes and learned from them. The process was healing for Wade, answering questions he'd carried for years, and it was equally meaningful for Samuel, who found in sharing these memories a way to honor his fallen friend and captain. The bond between the sheriff and his deputy deepened through these winter conversations, becoming something that went beyond employment or even friendship, becoming almost familial. Spring brought thaws and mud, and with them the usual troubles that came when men who'd been cooped up all winter emerged looking for entertainment and release. A group of rustlers tried to make their way through Redemption Creek with a small herd of stolen cattle, and it was Samuel's keen eye that spotted the brands had been poorly altered. The confrontation that followed tested the partnership between Wade and Samuel, requiring Wade's quick reflexes and Samuel's steady aim, working in concert to subdue the rustlers without bloodshed. The success of this operation, accomplished with minimal violence and maximum efficiency, further cemented the reputation of Redemption Creek's lawmen. Word spread through the territory that the town had a sheriff who was fast with a gun and a deputy who was wise with his words, and that combination made it a poor choice for those looking for easy pickings or a safe haven from the law. Crime rates dropped, and the town began to prosper as merchants felt secure enough to invest in improvements and expansion. By the time a full year had passed since Samuel had walked into the Golden Promise Saloon, Redemption Creek had transformed from a rough frontier town to a place where families felt safe settling and businesses could thrive. Wade had matured considerably, his arrogance replaced by genuine confidence, tempered with humility, and his quick judgment softened by Samuel's influence to consider circumstances before reaching conclusions. He still wore his guns low and could draw faster than anyone in 3 counties, but he'd learned when not to draw, when talking and listening could accomplish what bullets never could. Samuel, for his part, had regained something he'd thought lost forever during his years of drifting: a sense of belonging, of being valued not for what he could do, but for who he was. The lines in his weathered face seemed less deep, and the sadness that had haunted his pale blue eyes had been replaced by a quiet contentment. He'd found peace in serving others, in helping Wade become the man his father would have been proud to call son, in being part of a community, rather than always passing through as a stranger. One evening, as the two lawmen sat on the porch of the sheriff's office watching the sun set over the mountains, Samuel pulled the old photograph from his pocket and handed it to Wade. "I think this belongs with you now," he said quietly. "Your father would want you to have it, to remember him not just as he was with you, but as he was before, young and full of life and courage." Wade took the photograph with reverence, studying the faces of the two young soldiers, seeing clearly now the connection between past and present, understanding how his life had been shaped by events that happened before he was born. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for saving my father's life all those years ago, for giving me a chance to know him better through your stories, for staying here and helping me become a better sheriff and man." Samuel waved away the thanks with the same gesture he'd used a year ago. But this time, his eyes were bright with feeling. "You gave me something too, Wade. You gave me a home, a purpose, a reason to believe that my life still had meaning after all these years of wandering." The two men sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell over Redemption Creek, watching lights appear in windows throughout the town, each one representing a family, a life, a small piece of the civilization they were helping to protect and nurture. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried and was quickly soothed, and the sound of laughter drifted from the boarding house, where miners and ranch hands were settling in for their evening meal. The world was still wild and dangerous. The frontier still demanded strength and vigilance. But here, in this small Wyoming town, two men had found something worth holding on to. Friendship born from shared history, purpose born from mutual respect, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures come in the most unexpected packages. Wade thought about the arrogant young man who'd mocked a ragged drifter in a saloon a year ago, and he felt no kinship with that person anymore. Samuel had changed him, teaching through example rather than lecture, showing him that true strength came from compassion tempered with justice, from knowing when to draw your gun and when to extend your hand. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Samuel stood and stretched, his old wounds aching as they always did when weather was about to change. "Storm coming tomorrow," he said, reading the signs in the air and the way the horses in the livery were restless. Wade nodded, standing as well and looking out over the town they'd sworn to protect. "Then we'd better make sure everyone's prepared. Check on the widow Johnson and the Miller family. Make sure they have enough firewood and supplies." Samuel smiled at this, seeing Thomas Morrison's influence, even across the years and death. The captain's concern for his men echoed in his son's concern for his townspeople. They walked together into the office, and Wade carefully placed the photograph of his father and Samuel on his desk where he could see it every day, a reminder of where he'd come from and what he wanted to be. Samuel paused in the doorway of his room, looking back at the young sheriff, and for just a moment, he could see the resemblance to Thomas, so clearly it made his chest ache. "Your father would be proud of you, Wade," he said quietly. "So very proud." Wade looked up from the photograph, his eyes shining with gratitude and affection. "He'd be grateful to you too, Samuel, for saving his life, and in a way, for saving mine too." The wind picked up outside, whistling through the gaps in the buildings and rattling the windows, bringing with it the smell of distant rain and the promise of the storm Samuel had predicted. But inside the sheriff's office, there was warmth and light and the solid comfort of friendship, forged through shared trials and mutual respect. The two lawmen settled in for the night, Wade at his desk, working through paperwork, and Samuel in his room, cleaning and maintaining their weapons. The familiar routines of men who'd found their place in the world and intended to hold on to it. Outside Redemption Creek slept peacefully under the watchful eyes of the sheriff, who'd learned not to judge by appearances, and the deputy who'd proven that worth has nothing to do with the state of one's boots or the patches on one's coat. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to serve and protect. But tonight, all was well, and the ghosts of past mistakes had been laid to rest by the simple act of one man recognizing the debt owed to another, and the equally simple act of accepting that recognition with grace and humility. Years would pass, and the legend of how the sheriff of Redemption Creek mocked a drifter who turned out to be a hero would become one of those stories told around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. Some versions would exaggerate the confrontation, claiming guns were drawn and blood nearly spilled. Others would romanticize the reunion, adding tears and dramatic proclamations that never actually happened. But at the heart of every version of the story was a truth that resonated with everyone who heard it, that appearances deceive, that every person carries a history that can't be seen in their clothes or read on their face, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come from the most unexpected sources. Wade Morrison would go on to serve as sheriff of Redemption Creek for another 20 years, becoming known throughout Wyoming as a lawman who was tough but fair, quick with a gun, but quicker to find peaceful solutions. And by his side for all those years was Deputy Samuel Garrett, the ragged drifter who'd walked into a saloon looking for nothing more than a drink, and had found instead a home, a purpose, and a connection to the past that enriched both their lives immeasurably. The storm Samuel predicted arrived with the dawn, bringing sheets of rain that turned Main Street into a river of mud and forced everyone to remain indoors. Wade and Samuel spent the day checking on the most vulnerable residents, wading through ankle-deep muck to deliver firewood to the widow Johnson and her 3 young children, whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous fall. The widow, a woman of perhaps 30, with tired eyes and calloused hands, welcomed them with genuine gratitude, insisting they stay for coffee, despite having little enough for herself and her children. Samuel noticed the bare cupboards and the meager supplies, and after they left, he quietly suggested to Wade that they organize a collection from the townspeople to help families struggling through hard times. Wade agreed immediately, ashamed he hadn't thought of it himself, and by the end of the week, the widow Johnson and several other families had enough supplies to see them through until spring planting season. This was Samuel's influence at work, teaching Wade to see beyond law enforcement to the broader responsibility they had to their community. The partnership between sheriff and deputy became legendary, not just for their effectiveness against outlaws, but for their approach to justice itself. When young Billy Thompson was caught stealing bread from the bakery, most lawmen would have simply thrown him in jail or run him out of town. But Samuel took the time to investigate why a 15-year-old boy would risk jail for a loaf of bread. He discovered that Billy's father had abandoned the family months ago, leaving Billy to care for his invalid mother and two younger sisters on whatever odd jobs he could find. Instead of punishment, Samuel and Wade arranged for Billy to work at the stable, earning honest wages that could feed his family. The baker, moved by the story, agreed to provide day-old bread at no cost. This approach to law enforcement, seeking to understand and address root causes rather than simply punishing symptoms, transformed how justice worked in Redemption Creek and inspired other frontier towns to adopt similar methods. Summer brought its own challenges when a drought threatened to destroy the crops that farmers depended on for survival. Tensions rose as ranchers and farmers fought over access to the few remaining water sources, arguments that had historically led to violence and range wars in other parts of the territory. Wade was prepared to enforce water rights by the letter of the law, but Samuel suggested a different approach. He called a town meeting, inviting both ranchers and farmers, and mediated a discussion about how they could share the scarce resource in a way that gave everyone a fighting chance to survive until the rains returned. The meeting was contentious, with raised voices and threats flying across the room like bullets. But Samuel's calm presence and his ability to help each side see the other's perspective gradually wore down the hostility. By the end of the night, they'd hammered out a water-sharing agreement that, while not making anyone completely happy, gave everyone enough to survive. Wade watched in awe as Samuel accomplished with patience and wisdom what would have required violence and bloodshed under the old way of doing things. As the months turned into years, Samuel's influence on Redemption Creek extended far beyond his official duties as deputy. He became a confidant and advisor to many in the town, the kind of person people sought out when they had problems they couldn't solve on their own. The saloon girls from the Golden Promise would come to him when customers became too rough, knowing Samuel would handle the situation with discretion rather than making a public spectacle. Horace the bartender consulted him about his troubled son, who'd fallen in with a bad crowd in the neighboring town of Silver Falls. Even Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who came through once a month, would spend hours discussing theology and philosophy with Samuel. Impressed by the depth of thought in a man who'd never attended seminary, Samuel never sought this role as the town's unofficial counselor and sage, but his lived experience, his willingness to listen without judgment, and his hard-won wisdom made him a natural for it. Wade, watching this, understood that his deputy had become far more than just a lawman. He'd become the moral center of their community. The second year of their partnership brought a challenge that tested everything they'd built together. A wealthy rancher named Caldwell Briggs arrived in Redemption Creek with plans to buy up all the small homesteads surrounding the town, consolidating them into a massive cattle operation. Briggs was the kind of man who was used to getting what he wanted, backed by money, influence, and a crew of hardened gunmen who weren't particular about how they enforced their employer's will. When the homesteaders refused to sell, Briggs began a campaign of intimidation. Fences mysteriously cut, cattle driven off or killed, barns burned in the night. The small farmers and ranchers came to Wade and Samuel, frightened and angry, demanding protection. Wade's instinct was to confront Briggs directly, to make it clear that such tactics wouldn't be tolerated in his town. But Samuel urged caution, pointing out that Briggs had enough men and guns to start a war that would destroy Redemption Creek regardless of who won. They needed to be smarter, to find leverage that would make Briggs back down without bloodshed. Samuel spent weeks investigating Briggs's operation, talking to cowboys who worked for him, examining land deeds at the county office, piecing together a picture of the rancher's business practices. What he discovered was that Briggs's empire was built on fraud and intimidation, with questionable land titles and a history of violence against anyone who opposed him. More importantly, Samuel learned that Briggs had influential enemies back east, businessmen he cheated in previous deals who would be very interested to know where he'd relocated. Armed with this information, Samuel and Wade paid a visit to Briggs at his newly purchased ranch house. The meeting was tense, with Briggs's gunmen positioned strategically around the room, hands near their weapons, ready for trouble. But Samuel laid out what he'd learned with the calm delivery of a man presenting facts rather than making threats. He explained that copies of all the evidence had been sent to a lawyer in Denver, with instructions to forward them to Briggs's enemies if anything happened to the homesteaders, to Wade, to Samuel, or to anyone else in Redemption Creek. Briggs could continue his intimidation campaign if he wished, but doing so would bring down a legal and financial reckoning that would destroy everything he'd built. The rancher's face turned purple with rage, and for a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. His hand moved toward his gun, and his men tensed, ready to follow his lead. But Samuel didn't flinch, and Wade, taking his cue from his deputy, remained calm and steady. The moment stretched out, pregnant with the possibility of death, until finally Briggs made the calculation that fighting wasn't worth the cost. He withdrew his hand from his weapon and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Within a week, Briggs sold his recently purchased land and left Wyoming territory, heading south toward New Mexico, where his past wouldn't catch up with him so easily. The homesteaders were safe, and not a single shot had been fired. Wade was amazed at how Samuel had defused such a dangerous situation through intelligence and leverage rather than firepower. It was a lesson in power that had nothing to do with how fast you could draw your gun, and everything to do with how thoroughly you understood your opponent and what motivated them. The resolution of the Briggs situation elevated Samuel and Wade's reputation throughout the territory. Other towns began seeking their advice on handling similar problems, and the governor himself sent a letter commending their innovative approach to law enforcement. But success brought its own complications. A group of would-be gunslingers, young men looking to make reputations by taking down famous lawmen, began drifting into Redemption Creek, looking for an excuse to force a confrontation. These were the kind of men who'd grown up on dime novels about Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp, who thought that killing a famous lawman would make them famous too. Wade, with his known speed with a gun, was the primary target of these challenges, but Samuel was often included simply because he stood beside the sheriff. The first few times young guns swaggered into the Golden Promise looking for a fight, Wade was ready to oblige them, to prove his skill and send them running. But Samuel had a different approach that proved far more effective and certainly safer. When a cocky 20-year-old named Jack Henley called out Wade on Main Street, demanding a showdown to prove who was faster, Samuel stepped between them before Wade could accept the challenge. He looked at young Henley with an expression of profound sadness and spoke quietly, ensuring his words were heard by the growing crowd of onlookers. He told Henley about the men he'd killed during the war and after, not boasting, but speaking with genuine regret about the weight those deaths put on a man's soul. He described how the faces of the men he'd shot haunted his dreams, how he could remember every one of them, young men mostly, who died because they were too proud or too foolish to walk away from a fight. He asked Henley what he hoped to gain from killing Wade, whether reputation and fear were worth the nightmares that would follow, whether he was prepared to live with blood on his hands for the rest of his life. The young gunslinger, confronted with the reality of killing rather than the romance of it, found his courage wavering. Samuel offered him an alternative. Leave town peacefully, find honest work somewhere, build a life worth living, rather than throwing it away for a reputation that would last only until someone faster came along. Henley, faced with this unexpected response, holstered his gun and rode out of town within the hour. And word of the encounter spread throughout the territory. Other would-be gunslingers received similar treatment. Samuel, with his weathered face and sad eyes, became known as a man who could talk young fools out of throwing their lives away. Some listened and left peacefully. Others, too proud or too stupid to heed wisdom, forced confrontations that ended with them in jail or, in two tragic cases, dead in the street after refusing to back down. Wade hated those killings, even though they were clearly justified, and each time it happened, Samuel would sit with him in the office afterward, helping him process the guilt and anger and sadness that came from taking a life, even in defense of his own. These conversations deepened their bond, Wade coming to understand that strength wasn't about being unaffected by violence, but about carrying the weight of necessary violence with grace and continuing to choose peace whenever possible. Samuel's mentorship extended far beyond teaching Wade how to be a better lawman. He was teaching him how to be a better human being, how to hold on to his humanity in a world that constantly tested it. The third year of their partnership brought personal challenges that tested the foundation of their friendship. Wade met and fell in love with Sarah Perkins, the daughter of the town's newspaper editor, an intelligent and strong-willed woman who shared Wade's vision for civilizing the frontier while maintaining respect for individual freedom. Their courtship was sweet and proper, but Wade found himself seeking Samuel's advice on matters of the heart, with the same trust he'd shown in matters of law enforcement. Samuel, who'd never married, had limited personal experience to draw on, but his observations of human nature served him well. He helped Wade understand that a successful marriage required the same qualities as successful law enforcement: patience, communication, compromise, and the willingness to see things from another person's perspective. When Wade proposed and Sarah accepted, Samuel stood beside the young sheriff as his best man, filling a role that would traditionally have belonged to the groom's father. The wedding was a grand affair by Redemption Creek standards, held in the newly built church with half the town in attendance, and Samuel's toast to the couple brought tears to many eyes as he spoke about Thomas Morrison's love for his family and his hope that his son would find the same happiness. But marriage brought changes to the dynamic between Wade and Samuel. Sarah, quite reasonably, wanted her husband home at reasonable hours, wanted him to take Sunday dinners with her family, wanted to build a life that extended beyond the sheriff's office and the town's troubles. Wade found himself torn between his duties as sheriff, his friendship with Samuel, and his obligations to his new wife. Samuel, recognizing the tension, began to pull back, spending more time on his own, taking longer patrols outside of town, giving Wade space to build his marriage without feeling he was neglecting his deputy. This pulling back was done out of love and respect, Samuel understanding that Wade needed to establish his new life without the constant presence of an older man who'd become almost a second father to him. But the distance between them created a gap that both men felt keenly, and there were times when Wade resented his new circumstances, missing the easy companionship and deep conversations he'd shared with Samuel during their first years together. Sarah, perceptive and kind-hearted, recognized what was happening and worked to include Samuel in their life, inviting him to dinners, making sure he knew he was valued and welcomed. But it wasn't quite the same as the bond the two lawmen had shared before marriage changed the equation. The tension came to a head one winter evening when a crisis required immediate action, and Wade chose to attend a social function with Sarah rather than respond alongside Samuel. Samuel handled the situation alone, disarming a drunk cowboy who was threatening to shoot up the saloon, but in the process took a knife wound to his side that required stitching by the town doctor. When Wade learned about it the next morning, arriving at the doctor's office to find Samuel pale and shaken but alive, he felt a crushing guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. They argued for the first time since Samuel had revealed his connection to. She reminded Wade that Samuel had stepped back to give them space, had sacrificed his own needs for Wade's happiness, and that such selflessness deserved better than resentment and neglect. She suggested that instead of seeing Samuel as an obligation or a restriction on his new life, Wade should see him as family, someone who could be part of their lives without diminishing what they were building together. It was simple advice, but it cut through Wade's confusion and helped him see the situation clearly. Wade went to Samuel's room in the back of the sheriff's office, where his deputy was recovering from his wound, and they talked for hours, clearing the air and establishing a new understanding. Samuel admitted he'd been pulling back too much, trying to give Wade space, but in the process, creating a distance that served no one. Wade acknowledged that marriage required adjustments, but that friendship, real friendship of the kind they shared, could bend without breaking if both parties were willing to communicate and compromise. They emerged from that conversation with their bond not only intact, but strengthened. Both men understanding that their relationship could evolve to accommodate Wade's marriage while still maintaining its essential core of mutual respect, affection, and trust. Sarah, true to her word, welcomed Samuel into their family life, and he became Uncle Samuel to the children that came in subsequent years, a beloved figure who told them stories of their grandfather and taught them about honor, courage, and the importance of judging people by their character rather than their appearance. As the years passed, Redemption Creek continued to grow and prosper under the protection of its sheriff and deputy. The town acquired a proper school, a larger church, a bank that actually had money in it, and a railroad spur that connected them to the growing network of commerce spreading across the West. The Golden Promise Saloon expanded, adding a hotel upstairs for travelers, and Horace the bartender became wealthy enough to retire, selling the establishment to a younger man who maintained the traditions of the place while updating its amenities. The homesteaders who'd been threatened by Caldwell Briggs thrived, their farms and small ranches producing enough to support families and contribute to the town's economy. Former troublemakers, like young Billy Thompson, grew into respectable citizens, Billy himself eventually taking over the livery stable and marrying the youngest of Widow Johnson's daughters. These transformations were the real measure of Samuel and Wade's success, not the outlaws they'd captured or the gunfights they'd won, but the lives they'd helped build and protect. Samuel aged gracefully into his 60s, his movements slower, but his mind as sharp as ever, his judgment perhaps even better than it had been in his younger days. His hair went completely white, and the lines on his face deepened into canyons, but his pale blue eyes retained their clarity and the ability to see into men's souls. He became a beloved fixture in Redemption Creek, children running to greet him on the street, adults seeking his counsel on matters large and small, his presence a source of stability and comfort in a world that often seemed chaotic and threatening. Wade, now in his 40s, had matured into exactly the kind of lawman his father would have been proud of. Tough when necessary, but always fair. Quick with his gun, but quicker to find peaceful solutions. Respected and even loved by the people he served. Together, they represented something special in the often violent and lawless frontier. The possibility that civilization could be built, not on brutality and fear, but on wisdom, compassion, and the fundamental belief that most people, given a chance, would choose to do right. The end came for Samuel on a warm spring morning in his 68th year. He'd been feeling poorly for several weeks, a persistent cough that wouldn't clear, a weakness in his limbs that made even simple tasks exhausting. The doctor, a young man trained back east who'd come west for adventure, diagnosed him with consumption, the disease that killed more people on the frontier than bullets and accidents combined. Samuel faced this final enemy with the same calm courage he'd shown throughout his life, refusing to complain about his declining health, continuing to perform his duties as deputy for as long as his body would allow. When he finally became too weak to leave his room, Wade insisted he move into the sheriff's house, where Sarah could care for him properly. Samuel resisted at first, not wanting to burden the family, but Wade was insistent, and Sarah backed him up, making it clear that Samuel was family and would be treated as such. So Samuel's final weeks were spent in comfort, surrounded by people who loved him, Wade's children visiting him daily to hear one more story, Sarah bringing him soup and medicine, Wade sitting beside his bed during the long nights, keeping vigil over the man who'd saved his father's life and in many ways had saved his own. On his last morning, Samuel was lucid and peaceful, the pain that had racked his body finally eased by laudanum. Wade sat beside the bed, holding his friend's hand, and they talked about the years they'd shared, the lives they'd touched, the difference they'd made in Redemption Creek and beyond. Samuel spoke about Thomas Morrison, telling Wade one last time how proud his father would have been, how the boy had become a man of honor and integrity who embodied the best qualities of both his biological father and his adopted mentor. Wade, tears streaming down his face, thanked Samuel for everything, for the wisdom and guidance, for the patience and understanding, for being the father figure he'd needed after Thomas died. Samuel smiled, his weathered face peaceful, and told Wade that he'd received far more than he'd given, that Wade and Sarah and the children and the people of Redemption Creek had given him a gift beyond price, a home, a purpose, a reason to believe that his life had mattered. As the morning sun streamed through the window, Samuel Garrett closed his pale blue eyes for the last time, his hand still held gently in Wade's. His passing, as quiet and dignified as the life he'd lived, had been loud and impactful. The entire town of Redemption Creek turned out for Samuel's funeral. Businesses closing for the day, people traveling from neighboring towns and distant ranches to pay their respects. Wade delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he told the story of how he'd mocked a ragged drifter in a saloon, never imagining that the man he was humiliating had saved his father's life, never dreaming that same drifter would become his closest friend, his mentor, his family. He spoke about Samuel's wisdom and kindness, his courage and compassion, his ability to see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. He told the assembled mourners that Samuel Garrett had been a hero twice over. First, as a soldier who'd saved his captain's life in battle, and second, as a lawman who'd saved countless lives through his commitment to justice tempered with mercy. The marker they placed on Samuel's grave was simple but meaningful. Samuel Garrett, deputy sheriff, soldier, friend. He judged men by their character, not their circumstances. Wade visited that grave regularly for the rest of his life, bringing his children and eventually his grandchildren, making sure that Samuel's memory and the lessons he'd taught would be passed down through generations. In the years that followed, Wade continued to serve as sheriff of Redemption Creek, carrying forward the principles Samuel had taught him, approaching each situation with the wisdom his mentor had modeled. He trained new deputies using Samuel's methods, teaching them to see law enforcement as service rather than power, to understand that true strength came from restraint and wisdom, rather than violence and intimidation. The story of how Sheriff Wade Morrison had mocked a poor drifter who turned out to be a hero became a legend throughout Wyoming Territory and beyond. A cautionary tale about the dangers of judging by appearances, and a celebration of redemption, friendship, and the bonds that can form when pride is set aside and people are willing to see each other truly. Wade never forgot the lesson that day in the saloon had taught him, and he spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the second chance Samuel had given him. The opportunity to become not just a better lawman, but a better human being. Redemption Creek thrived and grew into a proper town and eventually a small city, its prosperity built on the foundation of justice and community that Samuel and Wade had established. The old sheriff's office, where Samuel had lived in that simple room, was eventually torn down to make way for a more modern structure. But a plaque was placed on the site, commemorating the partnership between the young sheriff and the old deputy who had transformed law enforcement in the territory. The Golden Promise Saloon remained standing for another 50 years, and bartenders would tell newcomers the story of what had happened there that long ago afternoon when a ragged drifter had walked through the door looking for nothing more than a drink, and had found instead a home, a purpose, and a friendship that would change not just two lives, but an entire community. Wade lived to be 73, long enough to see his children grown with families of their own. Long enough to see Redemption Creek become the kind of place where people felt safe and justice meant something more than the fastest gun or the most money. On his own deathbed, surrounded by family, Wade's last words were about Samuel, thanking his old friend one final time for saving not just his father's life, but his own soul, for teaching him that true strength came from compassion and wisdom rather than pride and violence. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.